Hi, my name is Jim Denning, and I wrote the book Make It to Midnight, Learning to Live When You Want to Die. That was me a few years ago. I had severe depression and anxiety, had had it for 30 years, and I was done. And I kept going to doctors, psychologists, neurologists, endocrinologists, all of the doctors I could find, all the counselors, and everybody I could think of. Nobody could tell me why I felt that way. I had a great job, great life, everything was pretty good, and all I wanted to do was end it. So I started studying the brain, learning how things worked. Eventually became a mental health counselor, and that's what I do now. And so earlier this week I made a video about narcissism, kind of explaining the nuts and bolts of narcissism. And one of my friends said, hey, can you make a video about addiction, how it works? So that's what I'm going to do here. So this video, what I'm going to try to do is kind of explain some of the nuts and bolts of addiction, and maybe it'll help things make sense. As far as the book goes, if you know anybody, or hopefully not you, but if you know someone who is struggling with depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts, please get them a copy of it. It's helped a lot of people. I've got 20 reviews on Amazon that are all 5 stars so far, so I've got counselors using it in their practices. It's how I got out of it. So anyway, let's get to the addiction video. So this is kind of an overview of the brain, really a side view, but an overview of the brain, different components. Let's start from the bottom and work our way up. So the brainstem is really just more keeping everything running, heartbeat, blinking, things like that. It has fight or flight or freeze as a mechanism in it. And it's more just, if you touch your hand to a hot stove, it pulls it away. It's anything that protects the body lives in there, but it's automatic, autonomic. You don't really have a say in it. As we move up, we get to the limbic system, and the limbic system is the mammal brain, and that's the brain that you see in dogs and cats and rats and ferrets. It's the same brain that we have, and it is the emotional brain. So good emotions, bad emotions, positive emotions, negative, as far as cravings and anxieties and depressions and all the things pretty much live in there. It's not quite that simple, obviously, but that's the source of a lot of these things, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And finally, let me turn my laser pointer on here, this helps. Finally, we're going to go to the prefrontal cortex, which is the human brain. Now, Freud broke the brain down into the id, the ego, and the superego. This part of the brain is the superego. This is the logical part of the brain, the adult part of the brain, the executive part of the brain. But it also is your intellect, your personality. It's those things as well. So it's not just straight logic. The limbic brain, again, the mammal brain, Freud called the id, and that was just profoundly selfish. The id wants what the id wants, and it wants it now. Why does it want it now? Why is now important in this equation? Because this part of the brain, the emotional part of the brain, does not understand time, does not have a concept of time. So if you're angry, if you're sad, if especially somebody who's really, really angry, they may do a thing that causes ramifications later on down the road. I just remember I worked at a career school. God, this is back in the 90s, and I walked out, and the lady was beating up a truck with a baseball bat. I was like, that's weird. So I walked up to her. I was like, why are you beating up the truck? She said, it's my truck. My boyfriend's leaving me, but it's my truck, so I can beat it up with a baseball bat. And I couldn't really argue with her. Now, I'm sure later she probably regretted that decision. But then cops showed up, and they're like, yeah, we can't really do anything. She wants to beat up her own truck. She can beat up her own truck. So those are the kind of things. Any situation where you're like, I don't know what I was thinking. This is why. And so let's break these down a little bit. So we've got the brainstem that we talked about. Is very basic, doesn't really bring in a lot of the emotional. Now the limbic system and the mesolimbic system are two different parts of the emotional brain. The limbic system is the anxiety, the depression, the anger, everything that is fight, flight, or freeze on kind of a higher level. So this part of the brain is a little more intelligent in the fight or flight or freeze parts of it. It also generates all of the anxiety producing chemicals, and we'll go into those here in a minute. The mesolimbic brain is the part of the brain that's the addiction side. That's the craving side. That's the part where it's like, I really want a chocolate chip cookie or a cigarette or a drink or whatever it happens to be. And then finally, the neocortex is the should brain. I shouldn't beat up my truck with a baseball bat. I shouldn't do 5 shots of tequila before I go to work this morning. Okay? The argument that we have in the human brain, that dualistic kind of dialogue that we have in our head, they call it internal dialogue, which means there's 2 components to it, but it's internal. This is where it lives, right here. So I shouldn't do 5 shots of tequila before I go to work. I really want 5 shots of tequila. I shouldn't beat up my truck with a baseball bat. I'm going to beat up my truck with a baseball bat. Now, why do these 2 oftentimes win? Well, let's take the lady with the baseball bat. She was so angry that the chemicals here went into fight or flight. When that happens, the prefrontal cortex is shut off. What this will do is it will stop blood flow to the thinking brain. She wasn't thinking. Now, same thing. If somebody struggles with alcohol addiction and they're going to work and they're stressed out and they're kind of shaken a little bit and they know 5 shots of tequila will calm them down, this part of the brain will, once again, shut off blood flow to here. And that's why addiction happens, is because the thinking brain gets shut off. Because when there's not a trigger, this brain's like, yeah, I'm good, I'm not going to drink, whatever. And then the trigger happens, that shuts off, this brain kicks in, shots start flowing, problems occur. So I had a good example of this earlier this week. I had gotten some gumbo, and Riley, my evil little dog, Riley decided to eat my gumbo when I went and got something to drink. So I knew Riley's tummy would be upset in a few hours, but what Riley is incapable of doing is matching those 2 events. Riley cannot understand that the gumbo she ate at 8 o'clock was causing her stomach to eat at 2 o'clock. So since she can't put those 2 together, the next time gumbo's out, she will eat it. She will never learn her lesson. That's when you train dogs, it has to be instantaneous, because they can't determine something that happened before equates to what's happening now. Riley will never be able to understand eating gumbo leads to being sick 6 hours later because it's too much time. So how does that mechanism work? Neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are how our electrical brain talks to our chemical brain, how our electrical brain converts things into emotions. And so that's the natural way that things happen. So, if you see something that makes you mad, it releases a neurotransmitter, cortisol. If you do something that makes you really happy, you run a marathon, you win a soccer game, whatever, it releases dopamine. If you go and see somebody you haven't seen in a long time, you run up and give them a hug, that releases oxytocin. And so cortisol is the stress hormone. So if something really stresses you out, cortisol will be released, and adrenaline. So you see an email from somebody at work and it's just throwing you under the bus, right? Cortisol and adrenaline, you're just like, you want to flame them and do a reply all. Hopefully you won't. So there's another neurotransmitter that relates to anxiety called GABA. And what GABA is GABA is a calming neurotransmitter. It's kind of like antacid for cortisol. So if you get really stressed out, then cortisol comes in to calm you down. And what it's for is kind of false alarms. So let's say that you're out cleaning the yard and you stumble over a stick that looks like a snake. You see it immediately. You're like, oh my God, it's a snake. Cortisol, adrenaline come up. You run across the street and then somebody's like, it's just a stick. GABA comes in to extinguish the fire. All right? Sounds great. So the problem is that all the good I call GABA a good neurotransmitter because it calms you down. Dopamine makes you feel happy. Serotonin makes you feel at peace. So the medications that do serotonin replacement, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, mostly antidepressants, can't talk today. Antidepressants are serotonin replacements. So the calming neurotransmitter GABA is a calming thing. It calms you down. And so it has been turned into a drug, a legal drug. Xanax, Klonopin, clonazepam. Now, people do abuse these, but let's see how addiction happens from a neurotransmitter level. So this is, right here, a GABA neurotransmitter. And what will happen is just normal day, you're going along, maybe you've had a couple of bumps, but nothing major. You've got GABA in the sending half of the neurotransmitter, and the receiving half here receives it. So let's say you get stressed out about something, but then you're like, hey, it's not that big a deal. GABA will be released. GABA will be released as a natural drug to calm you down. It comes out of these little neurotransmitters, just the ports here, and goes into what's called the synaptic cleft, and then the receiving side gets it. And so when this happens, electrical impulse here releases a chemical received by this side, you feel calmer. Okay, now let's say that over time, and this is incredibly common, this is actually what kind of got me, is over time, if you are perpetually stressed over and over and over again, all day, every day, your brain decides, hey, you're going to keep being stressed, I'm going to quit making GABA. And it's something called adrenal fatigue. So if you want to read about it, there's a lot of good books about it, a lot of good articles. If you look up adrenal fatigue, it will explain this. So when you have adrenal fatigue and you're not making your own GABA anymore, what a doctor will do is prescribe you GABA in the form of a benzodiazepine. So what the benzodiazepine does is it fills this area with artificial GABA. And your brain gets all of this GABA and you're really happy about it. Well, when this is abused, which is very common in teens and college-age kids, benzodiazepines are very abused. When you take too much, when you take a Xanax bar or something like that, which is a very high dose, your neurotransmitter, your synaptic cleft, is flooded with GABA that's artificial. So what will happen next is your brain will be like, whoa, that's way too much GABA, and it will shut off the receiving end here. So your GABA receptors, you still have the same amount flowing through your system, but the GABA receptors are cut off. Now what happens here? The addict will take more to fill in that void, and over time, more receptors will be shut off, okay? And that's a problem in and of itself, but let's say that the supply dries up, okay? You've got closed GABA receptors, and you've got a reduced supply, which means you are in real trouble because not only are you not calm, you cannot calm down, and either your supply is gone or you've taken so much that your neurotransmitters don't work anymore. You can't calm down with the drugs. And the other thing that produces GABA, just importantly, is alcohol. So you drink and drink and drink and you can't calm down. So your natural state of anxiety is way higher than it was before. Okay? Then you get addiction and withdrawal, and then you get problems. So let's look at some of the mechanisms real quick that control all this. So this is the reward circuit, which is the mesolimbic side of the brain. This is the addiction part of the brain. So remember up here, prefrontal cortex is the thinking part. All of this back here is the addiction part. So let's break it down a little bit. So let's say that somebody who's never smoked before smokes a cigarette. Cigarettes produce dopamine, or nicotine produces dopamine. So if somebody's like, see somebody vaping, hey, I want to vape, that looks really neat. So they inhale the vape, the nicotine releases dopamine. And where that happens is right here in the ventral tegmental area. These blue lines are dopamine. And it sends to the hippocampus, hey, remember nicotine. Nicotine is really cool. The hippocampus is our hard drive. So the ventral tegmental area tells the hippocampus, remember dopamine. We like dopamine. We like nicotine. We like cigarettes. The amygdala gets the dopamine and feels really good. Okay? The nucleus accumbens gets told by the ventral tegmental area, nicotine is good. Start looking for ways to get more nicotine. Bum a cigarette. Talk to somebody who's got a vape. Go to the store. All those things. Nucleus accumbens tells the prefrontal cortex, hey, go find us some nicotine. So this is the part of the brain that actually does things. Okay? So that's how it initially works. Those things are programmed. So ventral tegmental area says, I really like nicotine a lot. Hippocampus connects nicotine and dopamine together. Then the amygdala makes everything feel good. And then finally, the nucleus accumbens has the job of go finding more. Now, how does this work and why does this work and why is this in place? Again, 50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, we're sitting around, we don't have cigarettes at this time. All we have is hunting, gathering, and water, okay? This circuit was built to inspire us to hunt, to inspire us to go get food, Because being hungry by itself does not inspire us to get food. This circuit does. That's its entire job. What drugs do is hijack that. So say it's 50,000 years ago, we're sitting there, we're hungry, we see a rabbit running across the field, we want to go chase it because we know rabbit equals food. The dopamine is get up, go chase the rabbit, we're really excited about it, kill the rabbit. Had a Bugs Bunny moment. Anyway, kill the rabbit, eat dinner, everybody's happy. Okay, this is what happens now artificially through all the drugs that we have. Now the last part we didn't talk about is the ventral pallidum. And the ventral pallidum is the part that is looking for things that match that drug. So back in the day, it was looking for things that matched the food database. Okay, you know, rabbits and buffaloes and deers and all those things. If it saw a thing like that, that's food. Go get it. Now it's been hijacked to see, I want nicotine. Nicotine makes me happy. So the ventral pallidum is looking for cigarettes, cigarette butts, or vapes, or whatever, or it looks at a gas station. So there's a reason when you go to a gas station that they just don't have cigarettes written in a word. There's a reason that when you go to foreign countries, they have all sorts of tumors and horrible things on the pack of cigarettes. But here, you see a pack of cigarettes, you see a pack of cigarettes open, you see the picture of it because they're trying to get your ventral pallidum to get attached to it. Okay, so this is how that whole system works. Now, again, where addiction comes in, your prefrontal cortex knows that cigarettes are bad for you long term and they will give you cancer, but this part of your brain really, really wants it. So that's how that part works. Now, what if this part of the brain decides we're going to quit smoking and this part of the brain does not have nicotine? Then we go to the limbic system. And the limbic system is the part of the brain that is going to punish you for not giving it nicotine. So what will happen is amygdala starts saying, hey, where is the nicotine? I'm really not happy about it. The hypothalamus is the part of the brain that controls neurotransmitter volumes and amounts and balances. When somebody says you have a chemical imbalance, that's what they're talking about. So you've been artificially bringing in dopamine from the outside in the form of nicotine over and over and over again. You stop that. The hypothalamus has already adapted to the artificial nicotine coming in, so it shut off the internal dopamine because it's getting external dopamine. This is also true for cocaine and meth and any of the amphetamines, but also with nicotine. So the hypothalamus tells the amygdala, we got a problem. I don't have enough dopamine. The amygdala goes to the hippocampus and says, hippocampus, where can I find dopamine? Hippocampus goes to the ventral tegmental area and says, hey, where do we get dopamine? The craving cycle starts all over again. This starts looking for it. What's funny, what happens at this point, the nucleus accumbens actually starts generating pictures in your head of the thing that you are craving. So if you're an addict, it starts pictures of the behavior. That's why Bohr is really careful not to glorify the behavior of the addiction. Anyway, so hippocampus says, I need some dopamine. Ventral tegmental area is like, I got you. Tells the amygdala, you need to start generating glutamate here, which is anxiety, also cortisol, also these negative things. You need to start making the body uncomfortable until we get nicotine. And so we go back to here, the body's uncomfortable, the cramps, the irritability, the anxiety, the depression, the insomnia, all the things that go with withdrawals are because of this. So again, this is how that all works. You cut off the supply of nicotine or any of the other drugs. Hypothalamus starts generating this adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, goes down to the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands produce cortisol, which is anxiety. It's just liquid anxiety. It's intentionally making you uncomfortable. Now, the reason it's doing this is because it's similar to if you're starving to death or if you're, dying of thirst. You will start to panic because your brain is like, hey, we're dying of thirst. It's the same mechanism. Generates a negative feedback loop, makes you uncomfortable. Finally, your brain's generating pictures of this stuff. Everything you see looks like a cigarette, and then all of a sudden, that constant pressure, a lot of times people break and they relapse because they want this to stop. If that makes sense. Now, the last part we're going to talk about is just kind of a brief overview of the prefrontal cortex and how that works. So the limbic and mesolimbic system talk to the prefrontal cortex in that the prefrontal cortex is the part that actually has to make the decision to go get a thing. So the argument is, in your head, limbic system and mesolimbic system. Mesolimbic is craving the thing, limbic system is making you miserable. That communication comes out through the orbital frontal prefrontal cortex. The orbital frontal prefrontal cortex is kind of screaming at your prefrontal cortex, go do this. And your prefrontal cortex is like, no, I'm not going to do it. So here's how that works. Message comes through, we really want nicotine. Your ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which kind of and I'll go a whole other video on this, but it does past, present, and future. Ventromedial prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that is the project manager. That's the part of the brain that decided we are not going to smoke anymore because we don't want to get cancer. So the orbital frontal is like, dude, do this, do this, do this. When a relapse happens, the dorsolateral, which is the part that's a task, you're doing a task, you're actually reading or writing or watching this video or whatever, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex finally a lot of times says, I'm going to do this thing if you two will just shut up. And that's how relapse happens. So this is kind of just a different view of it. The salience network is the part of the brain that's just looking for input. And when there's a task to happen, if there's a task to be done, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex does the task. If there's no task to be done, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is the default mode network, this is your internal dialogue. Why is this important? These two cannot operate at the same time. Your central executive network, your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, when it is online, when you are doing a task, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is offline. Okay? So, a good thing to do in some cases when you're dealing with addiction is distract yourself. Distract yourself. What does that mean? That means if you're not doing a task, your ventromedial prefrontal cortex will come online and start really having a problem with the orbital frontal, begging it to go get dopamine. So if you're not doing a task, when I work with people who struggle with alcohol, they always ask the same question. What do people do from 5 to 9 p.m. or 5 to 10, whatever it is? Because that's when they drink. Now, why is that a problem? Why 5 to 9? Because they work 8 to 5. They're busy from 8 to 5. Okay, so they don't generally drink from 8 to 5. But from 5 to 10, they're alone with their thoughts. They're alone with their thoughts, which is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And like I said, I'll do a whole other video on that. But the important part of this is distract yourself. Do a task. It doesn't matter what the task is. Something more active is better because reading a book your other brain will kind of get in the way of this one. But if you can do a task, if you can go out for a walk, if you can go do a thing at a place where you cannot get the drug you're craving, you will be a lot better off. I hope all of this makes sense. It makes sense in my head. I just don't know if it makes sense when I say it out loud. But anyway, I'm going to put it on the page and let me know what you guys think. And if you have any questions, let me know. And these are the websites. ART Center SA, I'll explain that one later, makeittomidnight.org. And then if you have counseling or just any other questions, you can email me here. Also, the book is on Amazon, Make It to Midnight. And thanks a lot.